Hi, I'm Old Norse Specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford. Over the past few years, I've been making a big cause out of sharing the best information that I can about Norse mythology online on my YouTube channel, as well as in my translations of the original sources of Norse mythology, so that anyone can access this stuff, because it's so easy to get modern storytellers and enthusiast reworkings of this stuff, but often fairly difficult to find the original medieval sources. Now, one of the most popular characters of our original medieval sources is the god Loki. And probably no figure in Norse myth other than Odin is so consistently misrepresented in many ways in popular culture. Now, of course, modern storytellers can do what they want, but we need to approach the medieval myths with an appreciation of what's really there. So just a quick note, if you're not familiar with our sources of Norse mythology, the two books called the Eddas are the real direct link that we have to pre-Christian mythology in Northern Europe. Now, the Poetic Edda is a compilation of about 30 poems, many of which can be dated by linguistic evidence to before the conversion of Iceland to Christianity in 1000. And then many of those poems are explained and excerpted along with other poems that didn't make it into that collection in a book by Chieftain Snorri Sturluson called the Prose Edda. I'm not going to dwell any longer on these sources and their details here, but I'll put a link in a card at the top right for anyone who wants more about them. All right, top misconceptions about Loki. 1, he is actually not Thor's brother, although he's portrayed that way in Marvel and in some other popular stories today. Thor is the son of Odin and a Jotun, or so-called giant woman, named Jord or Fjorgyn. And Loki is the son of a goddess named Laufey and a Jotun, or so-called giant, named Thorbauti. They are not adoptive brothers either. However, Loki is a blood brother with Odin, according to an oath that they both acknowledge in a poem in the Poetic Edda called Lokasenna. So you might consider Loki something of a adoptive or foster uncle to Thor, which is an odd angle at it, although no one ever calls him Thor's uncle. Number 2, as I just alluded to, Laufey is not Loki's father, although this is another aspect of his Marvel identity. Laufey is the mother of Loki, although we don't really know anything about her. Well, we do know she has an alternate name, Knoll, meaning needle. Laufey is, if it quote-unquote means anything, the pieces of it mean leaf island. Some people have seen that as tree, but typically names are not that literal in meaning in Norse myth. His dad is the Jotun or giant, Thorbauti. Now, Thorbauti, like the other Jotnar or giants, is not a different species from the gods. These beings are in fact of similar appearance to the gods and similar size. They're not giant blue aliens like in the Marvel universe. Instead, the gods and the Jotnar are really parts of one big extended family. As I already mentioned, Thor is the son of a Jotun woman himself. Number 3, Loki has actually a fairly limited portfolio of magic powers as against the unlimited portfolio that you often see in, again, Marvel and other popular stories. His main powers, such as they are essentially limited to shape changing. He can take just about any animal or person shape and does so in many of the stories that we see about him. Now, that particular power of shape changing is actually common to the Jotnar, or so-called giants, who often take the form of animals. And Ármann Jakobsson, one of the foremost scholars of Norse mythology today, has pointed out that Loki is then almost a prototypical Jotun or giant. It's just that he lives among the gods for whatever reason, perhaps related to the blood brotherhood that he and Odin swore for unknown reasons. But he doesn't have unlimited powers. He's not this unlimited illusionist and otherwise magician or wizard figure that you see in Marvel and some other places. give me a quick moment to give you a quick word from my sponsor, and then I'll come back with 2 more big misconceptions about Loki. Number 4, Loki's role is not precisely equivalent to Satan's. There's a way in which modern commentators and readers are kind of, it seems, inextricably drawn to viewing Norse mythology through a Christian influenced lens, because, of course, in the United States and many other countries in the Western world today, we are immersed in a Christian or post-Christian concept of religion and look for analogies, right? People want the Eddas to be a sacred text like the Bible, when in fact they originate in a very different way, have a very different purpose. And people want, you know, a savior or omnipotent figure from among the Aesir gods, and they look for something of a devil figure, and Loki's a pretty easy person to point to, partially because of the superficial resemblance of his name to Lucifer. They're not related, though. Lucifer, of course, in Latin, Lightbringer. Loki probably means the ender or closer. The name is related to the English word lock. He also is not this oppositional figure to the gods in the same way Satan is, and he's not a tempter in the same way Satan is. You know, Satan doesn't accompany Jesus on most of his journeys in the same way that Loki is often found at Thor's side in so many of Thor's adventures. For example, Thrymskvida, which Thor goes to the land of the Jotnar disguised as a bride. They are Loki's relationship with the gods is ambivalent, it's ambiguous, and it's multivalent. It's very, very different from the sinister and manipulative figure of Satan. In fact, Loki is really not as manipulative as he's often portrayed in popular literature. He's a fairly simple liar. He's a huge liar. He lies all the time, but his lies are not that elaborate, right? So, for example, when the Jotun Thjatsi, disguised as an eagle, forces Loki to get Idun, the goddess who keeps the golden apples that the gods eat to remain young, he forces Loki to get Idun outside of the walls of Osgard, where the gods live. And Loki simply goes to her and says, hey, there's some better apples outside the walls. You want to come look at them? Right? To someone who has apples that keep gods from aging, says, come look at these better apples. Fairly simple liar figure rather than an elaborate trickster, and not a purely oppositional figure, even though at the end, at Ragnarok, he will lead the gods' enemies against them. Probably the biggest misconception about Loki is that he is a figure associated with fire. I think the origin of this can be put down largely to Wagner popularizing the conception of Loki as a fire-related figure. And I think Wagner got it partially from the story that Snorri tells in his Prose Edda, that Loki and Thor and Thor's child slave Thjolvi and Roskva visited a figure named Utgard the Loki, who, for all the world, seems like Loki. And while they're there, the traveling gods have to engage in some contests to earn their dinner at Utgard the Loki's place. And the contest that Loki has to play at is having an eating contest against someone named Logi. And it turns out Loki, which just literally means flame, is literally flame. He's having an eating contest against flame, and of course he loses it because flame can consume anything and everything. I think that coincidence of name, Loki sounds like Loki, even though they're completely unrelated words, plus the fact that he's put in opposition to the literal flame in that story, has suggested the flame idea to people. But there's nothing else in Loki's portfolio of stories or limited abilities that suggest any connection with fire whatsoever. There's a popular concept online that he has red hair. It's never stated that he has red hair anywhere in the Eddas. And in fact, you know, Thor would almost strike you as a little bit more of a god of fire if that's your criterion, right? Because Thor's the one who has red hair. I can't even think off the top of my head of a time when Loki lights a fire. So it's very persistent that Loki is identified as a god of fire in our modern mythos. You know, Dungeons and Dragons has him as a god of fire and such too. I think that's largely to be put down to the fact that people today want to see the Norse gods, as many polytheistic sets of gods, as fundamentally nature or elemental deities, which they really aren't. The gods are personalities, right? I have a sense of who Loki would be to sit down at a table with, same with Thor. I don't necessarily have a sense of, you know, how many hit points they have or what elemental force they might have at their command. So we need to frame our understanding of the medieval sources by thinking about the actual medieval sources and not letting modern stories such as those of Marvel, Dungeons and Dragons and such influence too much our ideas of what people thought about Loki 1,000 years ago, because they're actually pretty different from anything you're going to see on the screen today. Well, from beautiful Colorado, let me wish you all the best.